Hey people, welcome to episode 3 of Rough Vocal Effects Revisited. Today I'm gonna give you an update on how I subcategorize Fry Scream. If you haven't watched my original Rough Vocal Effects 101 series yet, parts of this video might be a bit hard to grasp for you, because I'm gonna use terminology that I defined and explained more thoroughly back in 2020. I also recommend watching episode 2 of my collected monologue series, where I first came up with the subcategorization of fry screams, as well as the previous episode of this series, Rough Vocal Effects Revisited, as I'm gonna reference both videos quite often. Might seem like a lot of commitment, but this is gonna be nerdy stuff, and if you really want to dive deeper into advanced vocal techniques like these, you better make sure you've got your basics right, so you don't get too frustrated later on in the process. Okay, enough of the disclaimers, let's start! In 2020, I've defined fry scream as an effect that's based on irregular creaking, so the sound of your vocal folds vibrating chaotically. It's not like I actually came up with this definition myself though. The original term has been coined by Melissa Cross around 2004 and since has been an integral part of the metal community's vocabulary. Of course, the usage of fry scream hasn't been limited to that genre or time span. Rock, punk and soul singers have used variations of it for decades. In modern metal, however, you rarely hear the pure kind of fry scream as demonstrated by Melissa Cross herself anymore. Combinations with other vocal effects, as well as different degrees of tonality and intensity, are all being thrown into the same category, which leads to a lot of confusion among aspiring metal vocalists. In my collected monologues, episode 2, I've introduced the idea of a continuum of fry in an attempt to add a bit more nuance to the fry screaming discourse, and some colleagues of mine have actually adapted the terminology I suggested there. Teaching fry scream based on the distinction of quiet, medium and loud fry has made my lessons much more effective, but new didactic challenges have occurred, and my understanding of fry scream has grown even deeper since then, so let's take a look at my 2021 model of fry scream. So far I've differentiated 3 intensities of fry scream: quiet fry scream, medium fry scream and loud fry scream. Here's what my demonstrations from the collected monologues video sound like.
Yow! The quiet fry scream. Yow! More of that medium fry scream and yow! This very desperate and emotional loud fry scream.
Apart from the volume level, those variations also differ in terms of registration, with quiet fry being falsetto based, medium fry being mix based, and loud fry being based on full voice. I've also always used the category of hypercompressed scream, which is technically a fry-based technique too, but works a bit differently, which is why I hadn't included it in my 2021 Continuum of Fry. Since then, my understanding of fry scream has evolved. For example, some students of mine have been able to get the sound of quiet fry scream in modal voice or chest voice, which contradicts my definition of it. Other people have managed to make their falsetto-based fry scream so loud that I can't possibly call it quiet fry anymore, and some examples of what I would have called loud fry have turned out to be only medium volume, while still clearly being achieved differently from what I call medium fry screams. This has caused me to rename and redefine my categories. Instead of quiet and loud fry, from now on it's gonna be basic and pushed fry. Medium fry stays medium fry, because that word doesn't exclusively refer to volume. And while in most cases, basic fry still starts from a falsetto point, medium fry still involves mix, and pushed fry still sounds quite chesty, that's not the most exciting aspect anymore. Instead, basic fry is now based on irregular creaking, which is this sound. Ah! Medium fry is based on some form of instability, like yodeling. Ah! And pushed fry is obviously just based on pushing. All of those words describe different strategies of achieving some kind of chaos in the vibration of the vocal folds, so the fundamental definition of fry scream stays the same. Now that we're talking about strategies instead of intensities, we might as well include hypercompressed fry scream as a 4th category. Those who've watched the previous episode of this series might remember that hypercompression is based on the Valsalva maneuver. If you've had trouble following my explanations so far, don't worry, hopefully it'll all make sense at the end of this video. To make it a bit easier for your brains, we're gonna assign colors again. Blue for basic fry, yellow for medium fry, red for pushed fry, and green for hypercompressed fry. Now we're ready to take a look at our new Continuum of Fry. It's basically the same as the old one, but a bit more accurate and more colorful. Similar to the Continuum of Distortion, we have tendencies of volume and airflow, as well as varying levels of control and effort between the techniques. And again, we're going to assume that the more you focus on one strategy at a time, the more successful your attempts at stabilizing your scream are going to be. This continuum is nice and fancy, but judging from the duration of this video, you must have already suspected that this is not all there is to say about Fry Scream. While some colleagues of mine might argue that volume, airflow, control, and effort already make for a decent description of register, it's a bit more complicated than that. Obviously, pitch range plays a role too, and as vocal fold chaos is always achieved by going in between of two clean stable points, we have to be quite precise about our categories of registration. I could probably make a full video or even a whole series on the topic of vocal registers. In fact, people have been writing books about this for centuries, and still there's controversial debates among voice teachers and researchers with no end in sight. But to make it short, here's my version of it. Some of you might recognize those letters and numbers as part of the French studies on laryngeal vibratory mechanisms, and maybe even have some thoughts on how they are an unscientific pile of shit. Others might just be confused. To both groups of people I say, relax. I have an interest in being accurate about these things, and an interest in making myself understood, so this is going to be a compromise, and I'm going to give you synonyms and demonstrations for all of these registers right now. M3 is whistle register. M2 is falsetto or head voice. MX2 is heady mix. Hey! MX1 is chesty mix. Hey! M1 is full voice, modal voice, or chest voice. Hey! 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 And M0 is pulse register or vocal fry. Note that by M0 I don't mean creaking, which confusingly many people, including the French researchers who came up with the theory of laryngeal vibratory mechanisms, dumped together with pulse register into the overall category of vocal fry. Creaking, however, is not a register, but an effect that can be applied to all registers. Here's creaking in M1. Creaking in M2. Creaking in M3. And even creaking in M0. Which should prove once and for all why it makes sense to differentiate between pulse register and creaking, and maybe even avoid the term vocal fry altogether. Ironically, this is a video about fry screams, with fry in this case referring to creaking, not pulse register. And unless I want to boycott a term that almost the entire metal community has agreed on, I have no choice but to cope with this inconsistency. You know what, let's just erase M0 from this chart so you don't have to cope with it. We don't really need it for Fry Scream anyway. Okay, now that we've established the registers, which are basically clean stable points in the voice, we're ready to get into the in-between areas of vocal fold chaos, or the dirty stable points, if you will. The first point we're going to look at is the creaking that we can find between whistle and falsetto. We have two ways of arriving there. We can either under-energize falsetto, or over-energize whistle. I tend to teach the first variant because most students seem to have an easier time finding irregular creaking without tensing up that way. But as long as we manage to stabilize the white noise that is required for a Fry Scream, it doesn't make much of a difference. Here's what Fry Scream from falsetto sounds like. Yow! And here's what Fry Scream from whistle register sounds like. Yow! For some students, just adding a bit of grip already turns the pure irregular creaking into a full atonal scream, but for other people further cues and exercises are necessary. In episode 2 of my original Rough Vocal Effects 101 series, I give more in-depth instruction on how to go through these steps. If you've watched all those videos and still struggle to find any Fry Scream at all, I recommend working on that topic in a one-on-one lesson. As this video is already quite long, I'll have to stay mostly theoretical here, but as you all know, good theory is often the precursor of good practice. Let's go to the next point of vocal fold chaos, the area between falsetto and heady mix. This one's a bit more tricky, as some people can only break from falsetto to full chest voice, or at least a chesty mix, but we need to be a bit more precise here. This would be falsetto to chest voice. This would be falsetto to chesty mix. And this one's falsetto to heady mix. Already quite a small nuance, and the creaking that we're interested in lies exactly in between of those two clean stable points. More precisely, we can either under-energize our heady mix, like this, or over-energize our falsetto, like this. In both cases, we have to make sure we have a decent amount of twang, because if we don't have enough twang in our mix, it just turns into falsetto. And if we don't have enough twang in our falsetto, we might risk pushing a bit too much air. However, if we get the balance just right, we can either get a pretty loud version of that falsetto-based fry scream, or a nice sturdy mix that works especially well for pitched screams like this. The next sturdy stable point lies between heady mix and chesty mix, but it's not as easy to find as the controlled creaking sound we've searched for so far. Instead, we want to embrace instability here and either yodel back and forth between the two mixes like this, or go to that same unstable spot by dragging a chesty mix higher without providing the necessary support energy for the increased pitch like this. Those would be ways of under-energizing chesty mix, but you could approach the same sound from gently pushing into heady mix. Chris Lipe has made several videos on exactly that kind of scream where he uses instructions like find the breakup, push into the break, or milk the break. So we can come alive! If you want to learn this kind of sound, I recommend taking a look at his channel if you haven't already. His terminology and some of his explanations differ from mine, but the techniques are the same. So we can come alive! This next point is tricky again. We can either push into chesty mix without allowing the voice to actually unfurl into full chest voice, resulting in a similar kind of breakup sound as the last technique, but usually louder and more tiring to the voice. Or we could start from full chest voice and approach the same instability by holding back volume without allowing the voice to transition into mix, like this. Wow! You might still recognize patterns of over and under energizing in these descriptions, but as we're now moving in relatively high volume and effort ranges, the support level will be comparatively high in all of those techniques, so even the held-back variant might feel a bit pushy to some people. There is one last point of vocal fold chaos left that we can go to. Pushing into full voice until the vocal folds can't any longer produce a clean pitch. An alternative, slightly less neutral description of this technique would be wrecking your voice. At least when I do it, I immediately feel that it has an effect on my vocal fold closure. Still, here's a brief demo of the sound, so you can recognize it in music. Wow! Just like with push distortion, some people seem to have more resilient voices and thus can afford more than a second of screaming with a super high intensity, but I still wouldn't recommend it for a whole song, let alone a full-length live performance. Again, then why would I include this one in a video if it's not advisable to use it? Well, because everything needs a name, even the bad things, especially the bad things. In hypercompression, we also have the option of finding vocal fold chaos with either more or less energy. With beginners, I usually approach hypercompressed fry scream from hypercompressed distortion, because as soon as you can do a sound like this one, you can also find creaking in it by, for example, changing the vowel. Wow! Wow! Lowering the volume. Wow! 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 Or even adjusting the posture. This clip that I've showed you multiple times already now is actually a great example of how tilting my head to one side has my vocal folds vibrate less and less regularly, almost to the point of an atonal scream. But even fully atonal screams work very well in that technique, and you can cover all shapes and variations with it, from low screams to high screams, from gutturals and pig squeals to tunnel throats, and much more. With more advanced students, we can take a chance on pushed hypercompressed fry scream. With slightly more airflow and volume, we can get much more powerful low and mid screams, as long as we don't lose the hypercompression itself. Often people will hear the sound and call it a false chord scream. And yes, the falsifolds, as well as probably other supraglottic tissues, are involved in this technique, but the behavior of the true folds is still very fry-like, including all the advantages of fry over false chord, like the possibility of high-range pitched screams. So I classify it as a fry scream. This push technique is much more tiring than the lighter version though, and should be used with an extra lot of caution. Now, how does this registration chart relate to the four main categories of fry scream we've established? The answer is moderately. We still can associate what I used to call quiet, medium, and loud fry, as well as hypercompressed fry with some of the points, which explains the typical registration of those four categories and can roughly be applied to my new refined concept of fry screams, but we don't really have terms for the other two dirty stable points yet. Of course, we could interpret them as hybrid versions, with number 5 being called something like medium basic fry or perhaps push basic fry. Or maybe we could even go back to the old terminology, which would allow for medium quiet, quiet medium, and medium loud fry screams. But I'm not too convinced of any of these options myself, so those coordinations shall remain nameless for now. It's not like knowing all the fancy terms would automatically make you a good screamer anyway. You have to experience the coordinations and find your own mapping of those sounds and sensations. After all, this isn't exactly a tutorial series. It's probably the most nerdy way anyone's ever subcategorized fry screaming, and I've warned you it would be that. Now, before we summarize, we're going to try to find a more accessible representation of everything we've talked about today. You might remember the triangle of distortion from episode 2 of the series, and now I'm going to introduce the quadrangle of Fry Scream. It's not just a square, so unlike the triangle of distortion, its sides aren't all equally long. It's more like a kite that's flipped over by 90 degrees, or maybe a combination of two diverging triangles. The colors already tell you what corner represents which strategy, but we could add the numbers for clarity and just be happy with our quadrangle. Alternatively, we could do the same thing we did with the triangle of distortion and identify specific stable points on this map of vocal fold chaos, with the most saturated and pure colors implying the highest level of potential control, and points of increased distance from the corners requiring more experience and precision. The gray spots I added happen to correspond quite well to the dirty stable points between specific registers that we've talked about. But now the quadrangle approach allows for an even more precise depiction of techniques than the registration chart, as we can split most of the categories into two parts: increasing energy and reducing energy, whatever exactly that might mean in each specific case. The more time you spend with this map, the more questions might arise. For example, you might wonder why category 1A, so the whistle-based fry scream, is located right between the corners of basic fry and hypercompressed fry. Is it both hypercompressed and not hypercompressed at the same time? Of course not. It turns out that if you want to stabilize a fry scream and whistle register, you need a certain amount of compression, which forces the vocal folds into a chaotic vibration with the help of the false folds pressing down on them, but doesn't quite behave like hypercompression yet. Or you might be confused as to why category 2A, so the Crislipe style fry scream, is located somewhere in the middle between basic, medium, and pushed fry. Well, the answer is easy, because it has aspects of each of these strategies. It allows for both more pushing and more atonality than category 2B, the pure medium fry scream, if you will. If we eliminate the unsustainable categories, namely pushed fry screams as well as the pushed versions of medium fry and hypercompressed fry, we're left with 7 sustainable techniques organized by strategy, register, and stability. The quadrangle of Fry Scream allows for a symbiosis of all the approaches we've discussed today. Now let's summarize. We have 4 main categories of Fry Scream, 3 of them sustainable. We have 7 subcategories of Fry Scream, 4 of them sustainable. We could differentiate even further in terms of how pitched or unpitched certain screams are, so in other words, determine the grade of atonality. And of course, we could go into detail about which exact effects are being combined, like creaking plus rattle, the so-called cartilage fry, making for a nice alternative to the usual creaking and distortion combo. Yow! 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 Or we could even afford a bit of breathiness in some of our fry scream techniques and explore how it can coexist with the effect of creaking. Wow! But that might be the subject of another video. That's it for today. If you found this video helpful, feel free to hit the like button and leave a comment. Also, if you haven't already, subscribe to my channel and hit the bell so you don't miss any new content. I've also added the links to my website and PayPal to the video description in case you want to schedule a lesson or buy me a tea. Thanks for watching and see you next week for the last episode of Rough Vocal Effects Revisited. Bye!